Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the Artlit review. We are going to discuss poetry and poetic sensibility this evening. And to discuss that, we have a very esteemed guest with us, Rashid Saleem, who is Associate Professor of English Literature and Vice Principal in a federal college in Islamabad. He is, in addition to being educationist and trainer, he is an intellectual, critic, and a poet and translator. He has translated the selected works of Philip Larkin, Sylvia Plath, Robert Frost, and many others. He is an avid reader of Persian, Urdu, Arabic, English, and Punjabi and Chinese languages poetry as well. And we are going to discuss with him how poetry is different from other art forms and what are main features of poetry which makes it as a mother of all art forms. Rashid, thank you very much for coming. And I have heard you in many talks which you gave at different occasions, and I've heard you have been talking on philosophy, science, literature, artificial intelligence, and whatnot. So how could you manage all these things? Because I understand you are a very busy person, but still you don't only dabble into these subjects, but you have full command on these subjects and a very deep understanding of all these disciplines of knowledge. So I'm just amazed how you do that.
Thank you very much for having me. And I think you have overpraised me. I'm simply a reader, and it's my passion. So I just read books in different languages and whatever comes to my mind.
What is that which inspired you in poetry, and how would you explain it as an art form and its related aspects?
Well, it's very difficult to define poetry. Different poets have been defining it in various ways.
Yeah.
But for me, it's something that gives you intellectual pleasure. So that's enough for me. And secondly, this is the earliest form of art, I believe.
All kinds of art forms or literary art forms?
In literary art forms, especially I think at the beginning of languages. In almost all languages of the world, poetry comes as a first literary form. And according to Rehman, one of the German philosophers, it's the mother tongue of humankind.
Oh.
So before we even start writing prose, before there was even writing, so the earliest forms that we find is actually poetry. For example, the epic of Gilgamesh, right? And even religious scriptures, they all have poetic elements in it. And in the beginning, people actually associated magical qualities to poetry. So all those magic words like abracadabra and many other in the past, they had the poetic quality.
Right. You said that you write poetry just because it gives you pleasure, and I understand that. But many other people have related poetry with kind of explaining certain ideas, telling the stories, and they have discussed different functions of the poetry as well. But what is more nearer to what you just said, I would quote Milan Kundera, who says that the purpose of poetry is not to dazzle us with some astonishing ideas, but to give us a moment of unforgettable moment and an unbearable nostalgia about that moment. I would like to hear what you think about that.
Well, I think in various ages, different people had ascribed various functions to poetry. Milan Kundera is right, because normally poetry does not deal with profound thoughts in the way we find it in philosophy or in mathematics or sciences. So when we talk about an art form, normally we look at the material, we look at the form and the content. I think as far as the content of poetry is concerned, it has been it's very difficult to tell what exactly is the content, because for example, according to Shelley, poets are like unacknowledged lawyers, but for William Wordsworth, it's spontaneous overflow of emotions. For Alexander Pope, it's the study of mankind or study of man. So you find all sorts of subjects in poetry. It begins with the Solitary Reaper. From Solitary Reaper to Paradise Lost, you can talk about nature, you can talk about gods and goddesses, you can talk about human beings, their social relationships. The fundamental thing I would say is the emotional underpinning that we find in poetry, and the subjectivity. So these, as long as these two things are there, no matter what subject you deal with, nowadays you have poetry about environment, you have soul poetry, you have love poetry, you have war poetry, and you just name it. I mean, anything that concerns us as human being, you would find it in poetry.
Interesting. Well, you have just said that so many subjects can be communicated through poetry, but is it only written word which is important in the poetry, or it has some relationship with some other art forms, or maybe some devices like sound, musicality, presentation, theatrics, and all those things? Do they combine into poetry to make an effect, or just written word is important?
Well, written form of poetry is only a recent phenomenon. It was always an oral tradition. And at the beginning of history, I believe poetry existed because of its musicality. And due to musicality, it was easy to remember things. So we didn't have anything to document our thoughts on piece of paper or any other material. So a lot of poetry was written simply in order to remember things. It had relationship with memory. And the way our memory works, I think its musicality, its rhythm, its cadence is very important. I would say that even today, sound is probably one of the fundamental element of poetry. Because although we read it on piece of paper, but there are various reading sessions held, and poetry rendering and poetry recital competitions are held, and we have public performances of poetry by the poets. Like in our part of the world, we have this wonderful tradition of mushaira, which is a public performance. And every poet, he tries to find his or her own voice. And there are certain poets, when you read them, you actually have the exact pauses, because the way he has rendered those words on a piece of paper, you are bound to follow the cadence that is behind it. And according to Robert Frost, poetry is actually sense of the sound. So the primary sense that it appeals to is the sense of hearing, although images are also important. But the sound effect is probably, which is, I would say, the fundamental. And it also has other elements of theatrics, actually. So you would find that during Mushaira, there are many poets who become famous just because of their public performance. Their content might not be that profound, but because theatrics is important.
You have just referred to Robert Frost and the sense of sound. It reminds me of another controversy in literary world. As you might be knowing, in 2016, Nobel Prize was awarded to Bob Dylan, who is a famous American singer and social activist as well in many ways. And some people thought that maybe novel fiction literature has lost its merit, so that Nobel Prize is awarded to a singer. But at the same time, the Nobel Prize Committee appreciated Bob Dylan as who has given a new poetic expression to great popular singing tradition. And on the other hand, some of the writers took it as contemptuous of writers to award Nobel Prize to a singer. And it's a very interesting quote from Bob Dylan as well, who wrote in an article and said that poetry is a singing songs are different art forms from poetry, literature, because they have to be sung. Like a word in Shakespearean plays has to be staged and acted on the stage. And he says, he addresses to Homer and says, sing in me, O muse, and tell the story to the world. Something like that. What's your take on that? I mean,
Yeah, I agree with Bob Dylan because, as I said earlier on, sound is the most fundamental element of poetry. And whatever words are written on the page, actually, they are to be sung or they are to be rendered musically. But when I talk about music, actually, it's not just the traditional rhythm or prosody. In fact, we should keep in mind that a lot of good poetry is written in prose. So poetry doesn't have to be in verse, but even in prose, it has its own musicality, it has its own cadence. Even ordinary language that you and I speak, we have intonation patterns, and through those intonation patterns, we communicate our emotional tones, undertones, overtones. They are all communicated through our musicality. Bob Dylan is not just a singer, he is a great songwriter, and song is one of the genres of poetry, and it must be appreciated like all other poetry. I mean, why do we expect that everyone should write an epic? Why not Kafi of Shah Hussain, right? Why not Rumi? His poetry is still sung in Sima or in Qawwali, as we say in our part of the world. And one of the famous form of poetry is called lyric. Lyric was actually accompanied with a musical instrument called lyre. It was a stringed instrument, and it was accompanied. Even today, a lot of musical performances, actually, they look for great poetic content. I would say, like Johnny Mitchell's, when talking about environmental issue of today, in one of the songs he says, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. So what else do you find in poetry? Isn't it poetry? Or in George Michael, in one of his songs, I think he was co-author of this lyric, he says, I'm never going to dance again. Guilty feet has got no rhythm. Though it is easy to pretend, but I know you're not a fool. I'm not sure if I remembered it correctly, but something to this effect. This is soul poetry through music. And dramas in ancient times, like Sophocles, Euripides in Greek, and as you mentioned, Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, and other dramatists of the world, they were essentially poets. In the beginning, drama also emerged out of poetry.
Really?
And certain other performances also got used. They also started being used. We can talk about T.S. Eliot, for example. When he was an acclaimed poet, he started writing dramas. And Robert Frost, actually, he wanted to become a dramatist. He failed as a dramatist, but he was a very successful poet. So this actually links it with other art forms like music, poetry. And when you think about musicality of language, actually you are talking about symmetry, about regularity, and about the pauses that make sense of the words. So because of this sound, we actually go beyond what the meaning of the words is. And that is what constitutes poetic sensibility.
Great. You have just referred Rumi, and you have also discussed poetic expression and its links with music and musicality, I would say. It reminds me of another aspect. You might have heard Coleman Barks, who has translated Rumi. And he doesn't know even one word of Turkish language or Persian language. He has not directly read Rumi's poetry. He has only read translations of Rumi in English, and then he had tried to explain what's the content of the Rumi's poetry or the spirit of the Rumi poetry, and he's very popular. If we accept what that poetry and poetic sensibility emerges from, its various links, sound effects, so in that translation it's nowhere. So these are two different situations. What's your comment on that?
Well, when we talk about translation of poetry, we talk about free translation. Robert Frost once said, poetry is what is lost in translation. So if you try to translate anyone's poetry, probably you would miss its spirit or the soul. But I would say that every language has its own musicality, its own sensibility, its own readership. So a great artist can actually convey not just the idea taken from another language, but even in a different musical, I would say, in a different cultural tradition of a different music, he can transpose it. So it's rather than translating, I would use the word transpose. Coleman Barks actually introduced Rumi in the United States. He is called the American Guru. One of his books, Essentials of Rumi, actually became one of the best sellers in the United States. What he did was that he didn't know Persian, but he read English translations of Rumi's poetry that was done by some Britishers, and he remodified it, poeticized it into the American diction of today's time. So he found that the wisdom of Rumi's poetry could be translated into the local diction and idiom of American language, and that's what makes him a great poet. Another example that comes to my mind is Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound didn't know a word of Chinese, but one of his books called Cathay, he translated Chinese poem into English, and he was so much inspired by the characters, written characters on a piece of paper, that he initiated the movement called Imagist movement in the modern poetry. So he, like Coleman Barks, he also looked at the translation and interpretation of Chinese poetry. Li Po, to be precise, one of the greatest Chinese poets, Li Po. He didn't translate it, he read the translated versions of his poetry and then rendered it into English, American English. So it's like recreating.
Yeah, I was going to say it's just recreation of a form of art form into a different genre, maybe with different understanding even, because he may be used as a, I mean, Rumi maybe just consumed to make someone else famous, because neither readers understand original poetry of, they don't know about original poetry of Rumi. So it's what Coleman Barks packaged his poetry for them. Well, he might be intelligent enough to understand what sells these days, and he made. Rumi is almost a fashion in the West.
So exactly, it has the commercial value, but I would also look at it from another perspective. I would consider it like a vintage. Old poetry actually is just like a vintage, and it intoxicates you, it inspires you, and you can create great piece of literature on your own. All great artists in the world, literary artists in particular, they were inspired by classical artists. So Shakespeare's tales actually come from Greek antiquity. Similarly, Ghalib, he took a lot of material and ideas from Abdul Qadir Baidil. Allama Iqbal, he took a lot of inspiration from Persian poets, Rumi, for example. So even to this day, this continues, and I would think that all old poetry is like vintage.
Okay, we'll come to this point again with a different point of view. But since this is about translations and moreover poetry and musicality, there is also controversy in our Pakistan about prose poetry. I'm a huge fan of prose poetry, but many people think that it cannot be considered as poetry by any way. So what's your opinion about
Yeah,
it?
traditionally all poetry was actually rhythmic. But I would say not all actually. There was, I can't recall his name, but there was one Greek poet. He wrote in prose before the birth of Christ. And I don't think why it's necessary to write it in verse. There are lots of things written in verse that are not poetic, and there are lots of things written in prose that are poetic. So poetry, I think, rather than defining it with verse, it basically it's how you use your imagination, your subjectivity, your emotional rendering, and diction and sense of the sound. So these tools are the most important. As long as you employ them well in prose, in fact, in English and in some other languages, great poetry has been written in prose, particularly in English. So I don't think that should be a restriction or a limitation.
Well, it is said about like many novels as well that they're just poetic.
They are.
Madame Bovary especially, its play of language, which is very important. And Vikram Seth has written some novels in poetic form as well. Well, this is a very
There are many
interesting.
dramas that are poetic. Even sometimes even journalistic articles that are written in the newspapers, even they have poetic stuff in it. So it's very difficult to give the precise exact definition of poetry. So it has got to do more with the technique and the form rather than the content and just the art of versification.
Okay. We've just discussed Coleman Barks and his translations. You are also a translator. I would like to hear from you what was your experience as a translator of the poetry, and you yourself are a poet as well. And I mean, just tell us about that.
Yeah, I find it very pleasing. In fact, when I was a student of Masters of English, and when I read Robert Frost, immediately in order to understand it, I would just go home and just think about it over and over. And after a few days, I would come up with its translation. It's very difficult to get the feel of it, to have the hang of it, but sometimes if you read it for a long period of time, sometimes you can recreate the kind of environment that maybe, if not the same, somewhat similar mood or feeling, and then you can, or at least you can be inspired by them. So I think I translate it because of pure pleasure and also to get inspiration, because sometimes when I think now I'm barren, can't produce any longer, I would read this inspiring poetry from different languages. Persian poets, for example, indeed, they were really very inspirational. So are Chinese poets.
Yeah.
And earlier on, when we were talking about the songs, I remember that in China, there are 300 poems that they used to make students memorize in the class. And out of these 300 poems, most of them were songs. In fact, there are different dynasties: Tang dynasty, Song dynasty, Yuan dynasty, and one of the dynasties is popular for its songs. Even in our Punjabi, Kafi, Maya, and there are many other genres or sub-genres that are popular because of the singing quality they have. Now, the problem is how do you translate them into a different language? Every language actually has its own sensibility, its own traditions, and its own impact. So actually for example, Robert Frost wrote in New England tone, and of course I can't translate it by keeping the same tone. I have to find the exact equivalent. So I look for the cultural equivalents that would produce, if not the same, the similar impact, and they would also give the same kind of aesthetic pleasure that was originally there. It's very difficult to keep the balance between the objective thought or idea that the poet has conveyed and the aesthetic pleasure that people can derive from it. But it's like trying to understand two different cultures and then trying to find the best equivalent.
Right. So you preferred to the idea which was presented in the poetry while you were translating these poets, or you preferred rhythm and musicality, and if you could reproduce them in your translations?
Well, both,
Okay.
but I would sacrifice some idea in order to compensate for the poetic pleasure, because as you earlier on mentioned, Milan Kundera, it's not the profundity of thoughts. The similar thoughts probably have been conveyed by many other people, but it's how he conveyed it which I think is more important, and what kind of aesthetic pleasure it gives.
You have just mentioned this Persian and Pakistani poetry, along with other poetry in other languages as well. So what strikes you most in our poetry?
I would say that our Punjabi poetry is really very soul-stirring. One reason could be because my mother tongue is Punjabi.
Okay.
And earlier on we talked about Shah Hussain.
Yeah.
If you talk about Bulle Shah, for example, it's really very moving. And I even remember some of the lesser known poets of Punjab, like Qadar Yar.
I mean, he's well known.
Yeah, he is, but I'm talking about the international audience actually.
Okay.
But even I think in Punjab there are lots of people who know Mia Muhammad Bakhsh, they know Waris Shah, but Qadar Yar is not as popular as them, but still one of his works which I find really very fascinating is Kissa Puran Bhagat. Puran Bhagat was one of the prince of Sialkot state, and its content and the storyline is actually very much like the old Greek like Sophocles drama. It could be, it's just that he has not been marketed in the Western world. So there are many. I think we can't.
Right. Okay, that's very interesting. But coming to another aspect of poetry these days, or even before as well, as you have referred many times, there's theatrics, its presentation. Do you think does it matter? And well, I just want to relate to my own experiences as well. When I was young, there were many poets who were popular, like Faiz Ahmad Faiz was popular. But I have attended Habib Jalib's session as well, and I consider him as a great poet. And he was very popular, and he would sing poetry, and he would relate to the people. He understood the people, their miseries, their imaginations, their dreams, and their frustrations. And he very skillfully used that in his words, in his singing, and his presentation. So that developed a very unique bond between poet and his audience. That is one thing I want to refer to. And there are some other aspects these days we can see. Well, in my opinion, they are not, I won't call it, well, I can be just prejudiced as a great poetry, but they are also very popular. Can
Probably
we?
you want to refer to the cheap theatrics that some
No, first
poets
I
use? No?
refer to the great poetry,
Yeah.
and maybe there are also other poets at that time who would you may call, but I don't want to be judgmental in any way. But I like Habib Jalil's poetry and its response of the people. Uh, these days, maybe it's not my knowledge, but I think poets mainly play to the camera for their own publicity and getting accepted by a large audience.
Mhm.
Uh,
Well, it's actually part of the public performance, and I don't think it. You can present great poetry through theatrics. John Elia, I think, is a good example. He often used these theatrical techniques, but nonetheless, his poetry is still great. Uh, he has philosophical depths in it, and sometimes he uh, just gave you an illusion that he is. But I think he feels intoxicated by the sound of his own poetry and the cadence that he has created, the voice, the poetic voice that is in it. And sometimes you can convey various shades of meaning through either singing it or properly rendering it. Uh, and music, of course, has always been accompanied with poetry. Earlier on, I was talking about Punjabi poetry, so you probably in your childhood have witnessed Bali Jatti, Inayat
yeah,
Hussain,
I'm not that old,
Alam
but I have
Lohar.
seen her videos.
Okay, Alam Lohar, and that was the public performance.
Yeah,
And Heer Khani,
yeah,
even today, you have these competitions
yeah.
where Heer is sung, and it used to be sung the whole night. And in festivals, even in old times, uh, in Greek, for example, there used to be festivals where they held drama competitions. In Arab, for example, there used to be Ukaz festival. So poetry, as we said earlier, is to be sung, is to be read aloud, and actually you find the voice of a particular poet when you read it, even written on a piece of paper, and that goes even to the extent of prose poems. So even when you read prose, and in particular, if you look at Noon Meme Rashid, for example, he creates the setting and you hear certain voices. Uh, and
Can you give some example?
Like Hassan Kuzagar,
Yeah.
his character, and Attar,
Mhm.
Bude, the
बूढ़े
old,
अवतार
yeah, since
यूं
it's in English,
दुकान पर मैंने
yeah.
देखा है.
So you can actually imagine a whole character and a whole culture in which this poem is set, and that gives you the awe-inspiring moment, I believe. Similarly, in T.S. Eliot, for example, who is a modern poet, you would find the scattered sounds in order to represent this mayhem of the modern world. Uh, just as you tune into a radio and listen to different frequencies, and this is all scattered, meaningless world, doesn't make any sense. This is the world we live in. So in order to recreate this modern world or modern sensibility, T.S. Eliot actually used all these voices in The Wasteland, and this is, I think, how uh, he used his poetic genius.
Great. You have just mentioned this Heer Khani, which was all through all the night, and I understand people used to gather to listen to Mushaira, and that went on for the whole night. But time has changed, I guess, and people don't have much time at their disposal.
Yeah.
Now, different form, even the environment around us is changing. We had the kind of poetry we are just referring to, it was very closely linked with nature, with the sceneries, with the trees, birds, rivers, and very intimate social relations. Now, the things have changed, our cities have changed, birds have flown away, um, flowers have withered away. I mean, we don't find much, we just find concrete in our cities. And people don't have much time to keep their emotions of longing and pain and sorrows for long. They just try to move on. What do you think poetry, poetry in these modern times would be?
Well, do you think hate has gone away, love has gone away, jealousy has gone away?
Uh-huh.
And because of this wars, injustice that happens, we often express our emotive voices against them. Uh, all these emotions, they are still there. And I would say that in this modern world of artificial intelligence, the importance of emotions is actually more, because no matter how efficient these gadgets can be, but still, in order to express your emotions, you have to look towards the poets. And in this digital world, uh, actually song and public performance has come back because of the social media. Now you have Insta poetry,
Mm.
right? The famous Indian American poetess
Indian
who
Canadian,
initiated it, Rupi Kaur,
Rupi Kaur. Yeah.
she became famous, and now she has access to large number of audience. And even in the universities, you have poetry sessions. You call the poets, and you ask them to render them in their own voices. And you have archives. Now you have audio books, and it is still sung along with the musical instruments. I would say that now we have come out of the tyranny of the print, I would say.
Okay.
And it has gone back to the oral tradition that we used to have. And now digital media actually has a great way to popularize the poets. And it always have.
Uh-huh.
Nasir Kazmi, do you think his poetry would have been so popular if there hadn't been radio? And John Elia, why do people quote Ahmad Faraz, John Elia, and other Urdu poets uh, on media? Uh, I think modern world has also increased what is called the consumeristic use of poetry. Poetry, of course, for me it gives pleasure, but it is also a product that people want to consume in their daily lives. In the past, orators used it to enhance the impact of their speeches. Uh, the writers, they used it. In articles, you often find poets, uh, poetry, chunks of wisdom. Uh, Even in Eid cards, birthday wishes, we needed some great poetry to express our emotions.
And
Nowadays,
even for publicity campaigns.
yeah, and nowadays, in order to update my status, to create memes, and even to comment on other people's lives, I still need those intellectuals and their words of wisdom in order to convey my own ideas. Uh, so you find Insta poetry is just one such example, and in Great Britain, for example, in America, uh, you have W.B. Yeats, whose poetry was actually, it became viral many years after its publication. During the 9/11, for example, many people thought of his poems like Mere Anarchy has been loosened upon the world, center cannot hold, right? So this, all this chaos was beautifully captured by W.B. Yeats. Or for example, his lines, uh, the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. Don't you think it's a truth, the kind of subjective truth that we want to convey? And these poets actually, they provide me with these products which I can actually use to enhance my own personal image. And
But
many people actually quote other poets in order to show that they are such great intellectuals on the social media.
but some people also see it as a use of this kind of poetry by powerful actors of the world or media managers for their own interest. And it's not quality of poetry which is being which they recognize, but it's just the I mean, poetry has been used as a device to propagate something else.
Well, all literary forms, they are political. I won't say that they are completely apolitical. They always have underlying political tones. And of course, in the time of propaganda, in fact, we are living in the post-truth era rather than the propaganda era. We definitely use poetry for those purposes as well. But I think it's not downgrading poetry. I say that every media actually has its own way of expressing reality.
Right.
So digital media, social media actually has different ways of enhancing your tone, your poetry, and people who are you can say well versed in theory, academicians, they don't come out of the traditional concept of poetry, so they don't accept this modern poetry. But I think modern world, in fact, has provided a very rich platform where poetry can not just survive, it can replace many other art forms.
All right. Well, it's a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much, Rashid. You came here and for all this insightful discussion.
Thank you very much.
We just had a very engaging discussion with Rashid Saleem. And viewers, as you know, this is a season of literary festivals. Many literary festivals are held in Islamabad this month, and they are supposed to promote art and literature in our society and in younger generation. But let's ask the people who go there and what they say about these literary festivals.
This ILF and as well as KLF are very useful for the promotion of literature and also for meeting people. Authors meet each other and publishers meet authors, etc. From Pakistan as well as abroad. So I think this is a very good initiative.
Literature festival, whenever they happen, they show that how rich the society is and what we have to show. And also it's a medium of expression and to appreciate creativity and to actually explore new writing. And I'm excited that there are a lot of new writers are presenting here today. A lot of visitors are coming, and as somebody who is old-timer in Islamabad, I look forward to be in this festival, and I also encourage others to come and enjoy.
I think the Islamabad is missing such kind of events, and Islamabad Literature Festival is a very pleasant surprise for us, and we are very much enthusiastic and happy to attend the event. These events must go on.
These are very healthy activities and very important, vital activities. These should be kept on in continuity, and I very much believe in that a city or a nation or a society is actually recognized by these kind of activities, and these festivals are actually the excuse of meeting people, the interacting with the artists, with the writers, with the performers, and for the upbringing, I guess for the upbringing and for the training and for the education of the youth, this is very important.
I have attended many sessions in this festival and I have learned a lot. In my opinion, these kind of festivals should be continued, and youngsters should attend these kind of festivals to learn better about literature.
I think that obviously literature festivals such as such do promote literature in Pakistan, and not only in Urdu literature, but as a student of English literature, I have experienced that it does promote to students and to critics as well, and I think it is a great initiative to do it.
It will be more effective if we can do such kind of literature festival in all over the city of Pakistan. It will be beneficial and very fruitful for the society, for the population, and especially for Pakistan, because we have seen such amazing stall out here in the literature festival here at the F9 Park, and I'm expecting something better from our community, from our government, to make such kind of event each and everywhere.
It's a great initiative. in Islamabad especially, because it has been a very, very dry city for quite a long time, and we were all thirsty for such events. It's a great contribution to the promotion of literature and and different kinds of discussions. It opens up a lot of thought processes, and it gives us a chance to deliberate and discuss the thriving issues.
Thank you, viewers, for watching this program this evening. See you next Sunday at the same time. Take care.